Whereas, allegedly, and I'm really quite ignorant about this, but that other societies, especially Asian societies, tend to people identify themselves in terms of social role, in terms of the rituals and their place in the rituals, and in terms of their relationships. And that suggests then that there's going to be, flexibility and so forth there too. But I guess what sort of motivated me to think that there's probably a core here that's going to be common is this, that being in control, roughly speaking, is something that by and large is going to serve the animal well, right? You don't want to just run every time, you think the big bad wolf is around. And you do want to have control over deferring gratification of various kinds. And so it probably is true that many animals have the capacity in varying degrees for overcoming pain in order to get the greater good. So Joe Ledoux, for example, is studying, and I think this is work that really, really interests me, studying the circuitry in the amygdala in rats. As you probably know, he's done immense amounts on the amygdala in rats that changes during fear conditioning. All right, but the next question is, what changes when the critter overcomes his fear? So you got them on the grid, and he goes on the grid and he gets his little feet shocked, so he hates that. So he runs off. But if you put a goodie over here, he'll do it, right? He will overcome the pain. So you want to understand something about that. And obviously there's going to be lots of cases where it will serve the animal to redirect attention or to suppress a desire, or that a desire is suppressed, or that pain is suppressed in order to achieve something else. So there may be some cultural relativity, but I have a hunch, and I could be totally wrong about this, that there probably is a core to all of this. Now, before we move on to the simple question, where do moral principles come from, I'm wondering whether there are questions that you would like to raise at this point, either about how we think about decision making and choice. Are there parts of the story that you'd like to add to this? Yes?
Just a couple of things. On the last slide, if those axes that constitute the space are purely internal measurements about internal states of a particular individual, right? And you're trying to talk about control, it's very hard for me to make meaning out of that if you don't put in there control with respect to what, right? I mean, control with respect to being pointed at with a gun, control with respect to falling off a bridge, right? So it seems to me that if the context that surrounds the individual whose measurements you're taking is not taken into account, what does control mean? So that's just that question. And then the other one is that, and I think this might be related, is that there are other sort of philosophical and political traditions that don't really have a big problem with constrained behavior. And they give it names like hegemony or ideology or a bunch of different things to talk about social processes that purport to explain why we do or not do things, right? Constrained environments of action. And I wonder if those two things, I don't know how, could be made to talk to each other.
Yeah, no, those are both really very interesting questions. I mean, on the first question, it could turn out that this ends up not being a very useful way of talking about this at all. It's just that at the moment, because we see this interesting difference in behavior that serves one's own interest between, say, someone with obsessive compulsive disorder and someone without, then, to a first pass, it looks like there should be a story there. But it might turn out that there isn't really. But there's another thing I think you're saying, which is really not included in this diagram, and I haven't quite found a way of including it, and that is that often being in control is very domain relative. So that a teenage boy might be highly self-disciplined with respect to the basketball court and his athletic gear and practice and so forth, but very impulsive in certain other domains having to do with, being in a car and drinking with a bunch of guys or something of that kind. So there is that domain relativity as well. And so somebody like Mort Duran, the surgeon with Tourette's, in the domain of the operating theater, he really does not exhibit the tics, but otherwise he does. And I don't really know how to capture something like that. But I would like to see how far something like this can go. We also think, as you know, that in addiction there is compromise control, and that quite a lot is understood now about what addiction really looks like at the neuronal and molecular level. And so loss of control in addicts seems to me to be not only a kind of real and serious thing, but it's also something with absolutely extraordinary social impact. So we might be able to get a certain distance on this, but I agree, it's hard to know. Yes?
So one thing I was going to point out is that I think your control space would probably shrink even more if you consider things like the Bruce McEwen's theories of allostasis and Amy Armstrong's work on stress, where if you get to a critically high level of things like dopamine or norepinephrine, then protein synthesis in the frontal cortex actually shuts down. So instead you have an inverted U, and then that fits with George Koop's ideas of allostasis within addiction, and it all plays together.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. It really, really does. And so one would want to put in additional parameters exactly of that kind.
Yeah, and it helps with the domain specificity also, because one of the things that Armstrong says is that there's a switch basically in the amygdala between sort of a basal ganglia strategy and frontal cortex strategy based on how high things like norepinephrine and CRF are.
Interesting. Where is that?
Arnston, Amy Arnston.
Okay, right. All right, good.
Mostly in monkey.
Mostly in monkey. Yeah, good. Okay. Anything else that anybody wants to raise on that? Yes?
The out-of-control region might also be qualified differently for different cases.
Yes.
Such as when you ask criminals why you've done this, they might give the reason of evil God inside me. So there is that the short circuit between the higher beings that the society believes in for the purpose of our actions, and individual empties that space of individuality and lives it between the society and the higher being that they believe. But when it comes to good deeds, they would say, well, anybody would do that. So that there is that compatibility between the society's values and the individual. And it seems like there are two different kind of out-of-control region in relation to the definition of the individual within that society.
I'm not, I don't know. In fact, I have just been reading about what criminals do say about their behavior. And if you want to read about confabulation, that's really a great source of the Baustein is one of the people who's done really wonderful work on this, but people who are the perpetrators, and this turns out to be true, even if what you're doing is taking a group of undergraduates and you say, I want you to remember something nasty that you did to somebody, and they were really upset and so forth, and just write about that. And basically, what they all say is